In Heart of Danger by Eliot Schrefer, a teen girl and the infant bonobo she has bonded with are caught in the middle of a brutal civil war in Central Africa. Heart of Danger has also been published under the title Endangered. In this video, I will be reviewing Heart of Danger using my 5P review system, which I've adapted from the original 5Ps created by BookGabber, a friend of mine on BookTok. My version of the 5Ps have purpose, plot, etc., prose, personal, and position. I will be giving a rating for each of these categories and basing my final rating on their average. But before I do, I like to give a rating based entirely on vibes. And what I mean by that is my post-reading, pre-analysis reaction distilled into a number between 0 and 5. And my vibes rating for Heart of Danger is a 4 out of 5. So let's get started with purpose. Why did Eliot Schrefer write Heart of Danger? The idea came to him because of a visit he took to the Democratic Republic of Congo, specifically to a sanctuary for bonobos called Lolaya Bonobo. While he was there, watching the conservation efforts and taking part in the conservation efforts to protect the bonobo, which is one of the 4 great apes, he was inspired to write a story about the bond between human and ape. The bonobo is a species which, for better or for worse, is inextricably linked to human activity. We are currently, and have possibly always been, the biggest threat to bonobos, but we are also now the biggest factor in their survival. Schrefer begins not with a moral lesson, but with a theme. And the theme he has chosen for himself is the enduring, mysterious, and sometimes heartbreaking bonds between human and animal. For purpose, I give Heart of Danger 4 out of 5. Now let's look at plot, etc. This is the category in which I examine the literary elements of plot, character, and setting. Let's start with plot. This is the story of Sophie and Otto. Sophie is a 14-year-old, half American, half Congolese girl, and Otto is an infant bonobo who has been orphaned by poachers. And we could say that they meet at the best possible time for Otto and the worst possible time for Sophie, because it is right before a civil war breaks out. Since Sophie is an American citizen, she can take part in an evacuation that is meant to get all foreigners out of the DRC. But doing so would mean leaving Otto behind and not knowing if he would be safe. And she just cannot do that. So she actually runs away from the UN officers who are trying to evacuate her. It is arguably not the smartest decision a 14-year-old girl could have made. And I'm on the side of all the adults who were trying to prevent her from making it. At the same time, I admire the courage and the love that it took for her to make that decision. And I spent the rest of the story highly stressed out as she, in increasingly desperate circumstances, struggled to stay alive and to keep Otto alive. Heart of Danger was actually a reread for me, but I had forgotten enough of the plot from the first time around that this new read was pretty harrowing. I could not predict what was going to happen next, and because of that, it made every new trauma harder to get over. This is a relatively short book. It's about 300 pages, but it still took me longer than expected to get through it because I could not start a new chapter without taking extra time to get over what had happened in the previous chapter. While it's highly realistic, it also gives Sophie plot armor. And she survives things that she might not have survived in real life, including one specific, very terrifying situation. But I'm not complaining about that, and I'm certainly not complaining about the last one, because if I could miraculously give every girl and woman in a war zone this specific protection, I would. For plot alone, I give Heart of Danger 4.5. Now let's look at character. Sophie is the novel's center of gravity, and she's an excellent protagonist and narrator. What I love most about her characterization is that every mess she gets into is one of her own making. So it's not just that one dumb decision that I mentioned. There are others, and well, they're not necessarily all bad. But what this does is it keeps her from being a victim. She's someone who can take accountability. And second, it means that this is not just a story of survival, but one of redemption. And I can't name a protagonist from any of the other novels I read this year who has this much agency. The minor characters are also very warmly drawn, even if they only appear for a short while. Some of those whom we meet at the beginning and, feel some affection for are unfortunately some of the first to be killed. And it's a trauma that I felt I shared with Sophie. After these first deaths, I got really tense whenever another person entered the story. Not just because this person could die, but because this person could be a killer. And sometimes it's better to encounter a crocodile or fall into a nest of cobras than run into some people. But for every bad guy that Sophie runs into, there are also others who are kind, even if they don't have to be. And through this all, I get the sense that Schrefer is clear-eyed about human nature, but also someone who feels affection and respect for the Congolese people. For character, I'd actually give this a 5. Now for setting, this is actually the second novel I've read this year, which is set in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The first was Congo by Michael Crichton, which also has a 5 peer review, though at the time he wrote it, the DRC was still called Zaire. And I gave Congo a perfect score for setting because of the way Crichton layered the political and technological and legendary, and of course the natural and environmental aspects of the Congolian rainforest. But Schrefer, who lets the rainforest just be a rainforest and the Congo River just be the Congo River, is doing something equally impressive. And I dare say I got a better sense of the Congo as a place from Heart of Danger than I did from Congo. In this novel, it's clearly a very dangerous place, but at the same time, a kind of protection from the threats that are posed by humanity. It's kind of a fallen Eden, which has a redemption arc of its own. So for setting, this one also gets a perfect 5. And when we add up the mini scores for plot, character, and setting, we get a 4.8 out of 5, which is the final rating for plot, etc. Next category is prose, in which I look at the writing style. I like to come up with 3 words for the writing style, and something meta I do is not repeat my 3 words in each 5 peer review. My unique 3 words for Heart of Danger are intense, relentless, and compassionate. I really felt as if I were there with Sophie every step of the way. And not just that, but because Schrefer gives us a sense of her inner life, I felt I was in her heart. I hope that doesn't sound too corny, but Sophie really is someone who loves very deeply, heart before head. And it is her love for Otto which gets her through everything that follows after she decides to stay for him. A lot of the intensity comes from Schrefer's detailed descriptions. He gives us not just a good sense of the terrain, but also of the toll it takes on Sophie. There's also some light comic relief, which doubles as essential information when he tells us about how disgusting her shoes get. It's both funny and dead serious. Can you imagine having no footwear for months on end except a pair that is perpetually moist and smell as if something died in them? And it doesn't stop. Like, just when you think, oh, we can relax, he mentions Sophie's shoes, Sophie's shirt. The writing style and the language definitely serve the story, so I give prose a 4 out of 5. The fourth category is personal. This is for my individual reading experience, which sometimes doesn't have anything to do with the merits of the work, though since I gave it a pretty high score for plot, etc., it does have great literary merit. If you already couldn't tell, I was very moved by Heart of Danger. And this is a spoiler, but as vague a spoiler as I can make it. When I got to the epilogue, I cried. Up until this point, the story had been building on the closeness between Sophie and Otto, or making a case for the bond between a kind human and a vulnerable animal, and depicting this as one of the most beautiful things in the world. And then the epilogue comes and shows us it can also be one of the saddest things in the world. Remember that we are not rescuing and rehabilitating wildlife in order to integrate them into the human world. It is to restore them again to their own world. And it turns out that the hardest thing Sophie has to do for Otto is not get him through a war zone, but to let him go. And Heart of Danger is so immersive that I felt myself in a similar situation, having to say goodbye not just to Otto, but also to Sophie. It's pretty rare that I will end a novel feeling sad that I won't be able to revisit the characters or see how they turn out in the future. And Heart of Danger is one of those novels. Another personal thing I did was learn how to sing one of the songs that is mentioned in Heart of Danger. I won't sing it for you now, but if you look up Olele, Olele, Moliba Makasi, you'll learn the melody too. For personal, I give this a 4 out of 5. Finally, we come to position, which is where I look at a book's place in the literary canon or its influence on pop culture. Sometimes a book's reputation precedes it, which is pretty good for its position. Other times, it doesn't have much of a reputation yet, and in that case, I look at the literary tradition in which the author has situated it. But Heart of Danger seems to be in a class of its own. It's a YA novel with survival elements like Hatchet by Gary Paulson and Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. But Not quite, because neither of those have war. And it has a human-animal bond, which is forged in the shadow of the animal's abuse by another person, like White Fang by Jack London or Shiloh by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor. But these earlier examples have animals that are domesticated, and we're not supposed to domesticate the bonobo. And frankly, Africa is a very atypical setting for YA novels. And the protection of endangered species and the conservation of wildlife in general is a theme that we usually find in nonfiction rather than fiction. So, in other words, it's a tough novel to market to its own audience. And that may be why Schrefer chose to go with Scholastic as his publisher. If you know anything about Scholastic, you know that they get their books into classrooms and to school libraries. And there have probably been a lot of young people, 12 years old and above, who got to read Heart of Danger or Endangered, its American title, because their teacher happened to have it in the classroom or the librarian ordered it for their library. Of course, it's also possible that a teenager would discover this while browsing and want to buy a personal copy. But based on the very few mentions of this on BookTube and virtually no mentions of it on BookTok, I don't think it's that kind of book. It doesn't have much word of mouth traction, and it doesn't seem like the sort of YA novel that goes viral. And I have to admit that despite an intense plot, a protagonist I grew to love, a fascinating setting, and a beautiful depiction of the bond between human and animal, I would also not find it easy to recommend this novel, especially to a modern teenager. So for position, I give Heart of Danger a 2.5. I am now interrupting this choppily edited video to say that I have changed my mind. I absolutely would recommend Heart of Danger to a teenager. And I would say it is unlike anything you have ever read before, so brace yourself. And if that teenager likes what he or she reads, well, there's more where that came from because Schrefer wrote an ape quartet. There are 4 standalone novels, each one dedicated to one of the great apes. While I've changed my mind, I have not changed my rating. It remains a 2.5 for position, which is not necessarily a bad thing. This tends to be the score that books get when they are hidden treasures that the rest of the world has not really discovered, but that are really great diamonds just waiting to be dug up. And when we add up all the scores, what we have is a 5P rating of 3.8, which I think is pretty good and close to the 4 out of 5 rating for Vibes. So what did you think? Have you read Heart of Danger? And if so, do you agree with my ratings and my comments? And if not, is this a novel you think you might be interested in? And if so, is it because you're in the target market or is it in spite of it? Please let me know in the comments.